Welcome to this explainer. Today we're going to impartially unpack the highly charged, really complex theories found in our source text, Anarchism and Animal Liberation. It's this fascinating collection of essays edited by Anthony J. Nocella II, Richard J. White, and Erica Cudworth. And what it does is merge two radical political spheres that you might not normally put together. We are going to strictly look at what these scholars are arguing, neutrally breaking down their perspectives so we can understand the core logic driving their movement.
Take a look at this striking imagery straight from our source. It perfectly sets that uncompromising, grassroots tone of the academic theories we're about to explore. I mean, this isn't about gentle reforms, right? The authors in this text are looking at complete, systemic overhauls from the ground up.
Because this material covers some deeply radical political intersections, we're going to break it all down into 5 key themes: the total liberation framework, critiquing lifestyle veganism, property, capitalism, and sabotage, against the prison system, and finally, a new animal ethic.
Okay, let's jump right into Section 1, the total liberation framework. Before we even get to the animal rights aspect, we have to understand the foundational lens through which anarchists view society. The text relies heavily on this concept of intersectionality. Basically, this means you can't truly understand or fight one form of oppression without addressing how it connects to all the others. According to the source, power and domination don't just exist in a vacuum, they form this giant web that traps multiple different groups in entirely different ways. The authors argue that what they call total liberation actually requires linking the fight against human oppressions, things like racism, sexism, and ableism, directly with the fight against speciesism, which is defined as the oppression of non-human animals. The authors contend that until you completely dismantle the underlying systems of hierarchy and capitalism, absolutely none of these groups, human or animal, can truly be free.
Moving right along to Section 2, critiquing lifestyle veganism. Now, you might assume these authors would be absolutely thrilled by the rise of mainstream veganism, but their perspective takes an interesting turn here, pointing a highly critical eye inward at the mainstream animal rights movement itself. Author Brian Dominick contrasts a purely lifestyle-focused veganism with what he calls strategic, systemic activism. He argues that focusing solely on personal dietary purity, just obsessing over what you put on your plate, actually turns veganism into almost a quasi-religious ritual, rather than a genuine counterpower movement.
So why do they think that is? Well, the source argues that simple dietary boycotts are just ineffective because capitalism so easily adapts. Think about it. If you just stop buying meat, the industry doesn't collapse. It simply shifts its capital to new global markets, lobbies the government for subsidies to cover any losses, and continues its mass exploitation. Your personal boycott, in their view, just gets totally swallowed up by the system. This quote right here perfectly encapsulates the book's core thesis. As Brian Dominick writes, personal consumption choices alone, while well-intentioned for sure, cannot trigger the systemic revolution these authors believe is absolutely necessary. Buying a plant-based burger from a massive, exploitative corporation doesn't actually challenge the fundamental structures of domination. Which brings us to Section 3, property, capitalism, and sabotage.
If lifestyle boycotts just aren't cutting it, according to these scholars, what exactly is their alternative? Well, this is where the text delves into some highly controversial territory. To understand their tactics, we actually have to look way back to this famous 19th century declaration by anarchist philosopher Pierre-Joseph Proudhon. Property is theft. Anarchists fundamentally reject the very concept of private property, arguing that it inherently prioritizes the accumulation of wealth over community needs and ethical considerations.
According to the text, the root of the problem is that capitalism legally defines living, sentient animals merely as private property to be exploited. Because they are legally no different than, say, a piece of machinery or a wooden chair, the system evaluates them purely based on their economic value and their potential to generate profit.
So, the crucial point here is understanding the Animal Liberation Front's principles, as detailed by the authors. These guidelines actively justify illegal property destruction, like breaking into labs or destroying equipment. But look really closely at point number 4. They strictly forbid harm to any living being. The authors emphasize this specific rule to explain why activists view their actions strictly as economic sabotage, rather than physical violence. For these activists, property destruction is seen as a highly strategic economic tool. The logic goes like this. If you can't simply boycott a massive industry out of existence, you must physically raise their operating costs through sabotage until animal exploitation is simply no longer profitable. It hits them right in the wallet.
This logical flow regarding the state and justice brings us right to Section 4, against the prison system.
So, should animal abusers be sent to prison? It's a provocative question, and you might actually be pretty surprised to learn that the anarchist criminologists in this text emphatically say no. While many mainstream animal rights activists push hard for harsher prison sentences for animal cruelty, the authors here argue that doing so completely contradicts the entire goal of total liberation.
To explain why, author Anthony J. Nocella points out that the U.S. Constitution essentially allows for state-sanctioned slavery within prisons. Because the 13th Amendment has a specific exception for those convicted of a crime, the text argues that inmates effectively become the property of the state and are often used for cheap corporate labor.
Therefore, the authors argue that relying on the state to lock up animal abusers actually reinforces the exact same systems of domination they are desperately trying to dismantle. By cheering for incarceration, they argue, well-meaning activists are inadvertently validating a punitive, racist system that historically targets marginalized groups and, ironically, often targets the activists themselves.
Finally, let's look at Section 5, a new animal ethic.
Let's explore how the text synthesizes all of these radical, intersectional critiques into a proposed path forward for their movement. The big conclusion drawn from these essays is that true liberation requires us to move way beyond just what we put on our dinner plates. The source proposes what they call a new animal ethic. This is an ethic that definitely still values personal behavioral changes, but insists that these changes absolutely must be merged with aggressive system-targeted social activism to be at all effective.
Ultimately, their goal is massive, dismantling the abstract machine of hierarchy, state authority, and industrial civilization itself. The authors argue that as long as an industrial civilization exists that views the earth and its inhabitants merely as resources to be extracted, animal and human exploitation will inevitably continue. Which leaves us with this final, highly memorable question to ponder from the source material. Is it enough to simply live cleanly and make ethical consumer choices? Or does true justice demand we fundamentally rethink the entire foundation of our society? Whether you agree with these radical theories or not, these authors certainly force us to critically examine the limits of our own activism. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer, and I hope this deep dive into the source material has given you a much clearer understanding of these complex, intersecting ideologies.